So we have one more talk before the coffee break. We've got James Milner talking to us about his experiences growing a FOSS4G project. James is based in London, he's a software developer, and works at Nearform. He's going to tell us about Terra Draw. So if you've been following OSGeo in the last 12 months or so, you've probably heard about Terra Draw. It's a project that's becoming quite heavily involved with a lot of the events and various things that OSGeo UK are putting on. Terra Draw itself is an open source JavaScript library for drawing on web maps, and James is going to tell us about the ups and downs of creating that project and maintaining that project. So, James, over here. Yeah. James, nearly over to you. Yeah. This is where I can make stuff up. So James also really likes to drive his Tesla around. He does a lot of beatboxing. His favorite color is purple. Green. Hear
Yeah, you're doing one check. In the back.
Yeah, okay. Awesome, perfect. Yeah, so welcome to my talk, experiences growing a FOSS4G project. Yeah, it's great to be in Bristol. I grew up in Bath, so I spent a lot of time in the Southwest, so nice to be kind of back in my old neck of the woods. Yeah, my name's James Milner. I'm a staff software engineer at a company called Nearform. So Nearform is a digital consultancy, has a long history in open source, have a lot of people who contribute to like the Node.js project and a bunch of other projects in the kind of like JavaScript ecosystem. So yeah, they're big supporters of open source, and they, they were allowed me to come in today and made it possible for me to come in today. So big shout out to them for just making that possible, really. So first thing I want to do is just talk a bit about this, the project that is the kind of heart of this talk, which is the project I've been working on the last 2.5 years, called Terra Draw. And so essentially, Terra Draw is an open source JavaScript library for drawing on web maps. Sometimes it's like maybe there's some ambiguity in what it means to say like draw on a web map. So I sometimes find that like just giving an example is quite a useful way to help illustrate what I mean by that. And one example that I think works quite well is if you've ever been on Zoopla or if you've ever been on Rightmove, they both have a tool which essentially allows you to draw an area of interest, draw a polygon, and then it will just return the properties that exist within that area of interest. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying like drawing on maps. So Terra Draw is actually much bigger though than just drawing like polygons. We also support things like points, lines, circles, rectangles, and all kinds of weird and wonderful geometries. And I guess one of the points of Terra Draw is that those drawing modes can have kind of like an infinite level of complexity, or like you can create custom modes and kind of do whatever it is that you want to do. So there's a bunch of what we call like built-in modes, so like point, line, polygon, rectangle, that sort of thing. But there's also an ability to basically quite an extensible software library. And the way it's kind of architected, that's maybe slightly different to other map drawing libraries. You might have come across things like Mapbox.gl Draw, which is like a drawing library for Mapbox.gl. But that library is like tied to Mapbox.gl, JS. And Terra Draw kind of takes this approach, it's called like an adapter pattern. So basically, 90% of the code exists in the modes and the store, which the store is like the thing that backs all the geometries and like where they're stored and retrieved. And then there's like this 10% layer, which is essentially the adapters. So there's adapters for Google Maps, OpenLayers, Leaflet, Mapbox, MapLibre, ArcGIS. I think that's all of them, 36. I can't remember which ones I've said or not. So, but yes, there's lots of different adapters, and it's also possible to write other adapters if another mapping library comes along. So it's designed to be very extensible. It's designed to be like able to work with like a bunch of different mapping libraries. So if the cost structure of the say you're using a mapping library and they change the amount that they want to charge you for base maps, then in theory it should be relatively straightforward to just swap that out with another mapping provider. Or they change the license of the mapping library, then you can also swap that out. But yeah, if you want to find out more about Terra Draw, I'd recommend. I've done some other talks at other FOSS4G events. You can find them on YouTube. Just type in Terra Draw FOSS4G, and you should be able to find them. And then in the short term, one of the simplest ways to just find out more is if you just go to terradraw.io. It's mostly just like a demo website, but there's also a link to the GitHub, and then on the GitHub, there's all the getting started, API docs, all this kind of stuff. So yeah, just wanted to give a bit of context and introduction to kind of what Terra Draw is. And then the rest of this talk is more about sort of like how the experiences of kind of like growing Terra Draw and how that feeds into a sort of broader ecosystem of like broader FOSS4G ecosystem. So I think historically there's kind of an old proverb in software that I don't know, like I looked this up and I think it comes from some like 1980s baseball movie, so I have no idea why this became this thing. But there was basically like this proverb where somebody was saying like, if you build it, they will come. And I think like my personal experience is that is just not true, right? Like, like I think like there is just like way too much. There is just way too many things in like 2024 for it to like you just to be able to build something, and then it like magically just appear in front of the people that need it, right? And so I think actually interesting now, like writing a software, like building a software project is actually at least partially also like a marketing problem, and like how you actually make sure that that project gets in front of the people who need it is like quite like I'm not a marketing expert, so it's just been like an interesting experience about like how do I make sure that people are able to find this? How do I make sure that it gets in front of people that would find this useful? And there's been some like I guess some interesting learnings from that. I think these are just like three things that I felt were just like kind of baseline level of usefulness for just like getting people in the right place. So first one is, which I've spoken about a bit already, is the website. Just having like a demo of like what is Terra Draw, like why should I care about it? Somewhere like a landing page where people can come to and then like click through into like more detailed information. I think that's been quite useful. It's just somewhere you can just like a quick link that you can just send to people. The other one is listings. So listings is like, so Terra Draw is listed on, for example, like the leaflet plugin section, and it's also listed on, I think, also the open layers and the map Libra plugin section as well. So it's like quite a good way to like connect up those things and like get people realizing that this thing actually exists. So that's quite useful. And then the last point I've got on there is like about tagging. So tagging is like on GitHub for a project, you can provide tags. So you can provide like, I don't know, I think Terra Draw has things like, like geospatial mapping, GeoChaser, drawing, like tags like that. And potentially that's more useful on platforms like NPM, where like people are actively looking for like packages for like to solve a specific problem. And so it just helps with like helping people find what they're looking for, essentially, just making sure that it's like correctly, like it's findable. I think historically, I've personally found like social media like quite a useful way to like maybe like build an audience and share what I'm working on. I think like, I mean, it's already been alluded to once today, but I think like maybe that's just in like a weird state of like disarray at the moment, and like nobody really knows like where to post things, or like, yeah, I don't know. It's just a bit of a like strange time, I think, to be using that. So like historically that has worked for me, but I think like now maybe that's like less true, and maybe like other avenues are potentially better. And I think like one thing that I found really personally like very rewarding is just being able to come to events like this, so like being here today, but also having spoken at other FOSS4G events historically. So London in 2022 for FOSS4G UK, Kosovo in 2023, and then this year in Tartu in Estonia for FOSS4G EU 2024. And I think that's just like, that's a different type of, I think there's some really interesting things about that because it's very like, it's obviously like very human and it's very nice just to be able to actually like speak to people like face to face about like what you're working on. So it's just like a different way of kind of like promoting and communicating your project, I think. And also it's nice because there's videos that are recorded and so you can use that as like, oh, like I just want to find out more about this project. You can just send somebody a link to a talk that you've given, which is really cool. I was also lucky enough in earlier this year, I spoke at GeoMob. Maybe some of you have heard of or been to or spoken at GeoMob before. But yeah, I was at the London event and afterwards speaking about Terra Draw. And Ed, who runs the event, was kind enough to invite me onto the GeoMob podcast. That was like a really interesting experience. Never really spoken like on a podcast before, so it's quite surreal. If I'm not sure if like anyone's ever done it, but it's quite odd. But yeah, really, really nice. And I got the opportunity to like quite a bit of feedback from that and spoke to some interesting people off the back of that. So that was quite cool. I'd love to do that again, but obviously there's only so many geospatial podcasts. So yeah, in the end though, I think some amalgamation of like all of these things I think has been useful in basically like growing the user base of Terra Draw. So I mean, probably the biggest user at the moment is actually Oracle, which is very like kind of surreal. They basically have a thing called Geospatial Studio, which is like a web app for like viewing and editing geospatial data. And so they use it. Another user I'd like to point out on there, which I think is particularly cool, is basically like the state of Colorado. They have something called, it's quite long-winded, so you have to bear with me. I have to read it out because I can't remember the acronym off the top of my head. It's the Center of Excellence for Advanced Technology and Aerial Firefighting, often abbreviated as COTAC. But they use it, and yeah, I got quite a nice message from a guy called Nick, who works at state of Colorado, and he was just like, I helped him fix a bug, and then at the end of the comment, he just said this. I'll just read it out. Your library just yesterday helped coordinate an interagency rescue of a mountain biker with a suspected femur fracture being packaged and airlifted to definitive care. But I was like, that's like pretty powerful. Like I was just like, it's quite strange to just like work on a project like in your bedroom and just write code and then somebody say something about something like tangible that's happening in real life that relates to something you built. So that was just like a really nice like spur on, I thought, to keep going with it. But yeah, just thought it was like a nice little story, so I thought I'd chuck it in there. Yeah. So I want to talk a bit more about like how I think, just some thoughts about like growing Terra Draw and how like maybe that feeds into like the broader FOSS4G ecosystem. And I think like the way I've come to think about it is like I feel like building an open source software community is a bit like kind of like a community garden. It's like everyone wants it to succeed and everyone kind of chips in and does their own little bit. Maybe some people, you know, make the compost, maybe some people plant the vegetables, maybe some people, I don't know, like scare away badgers, or I don't know, like what people do in the community garden. But I think that is like just an interesting kind of analogy in comparison to something like the alternative, which is like, I came up with the idea of like the supermarket as like the opposite of that, where it's just like people just kind of take what they want and then they like leave, and there's maybe not so much thought about like what is being like what's happening there, I think. And I think like, yeah, I think like one example of like where I think that kind of, I think the FOSS4G community does a really good job of being more like a kind of community garden. And I think a good example of that is the OSGeo UK code sprint this year that was in Portland. And so that was, yeah, big shout out to Nick, who's here today, speaking later on, Paul Whittle as well, who basically helped organize that. But I think that was just like a really nice example of like coming together around a set of problems, like, and like bringing the community together and just like tangibly like working on things together. So I think like FOSS4G is quite interesting in. So I also am involved in other sort of like technology communities. I think FOSS4G is slightly interesting in that potentially compared to other communities, it's like a broader spectrum of people in terms of like, it's like an interesting mix of like end users and developers, and then also like managers and people like all in between, which I think is just like, that's actually like quite interesting to actually have the people who are like using the software and the people who are building the software like in the same room. Like that is actually quite unusual, I think, for like technology community. So yeah, I just think like almost like there's lots of different things that like people can contribute to an open source project. Like it don't all have to be like nitty-gritty like code level changes. There's also like a whole host of other things that are like super important in making sure that like an open source project is successful. I've just listed like some of them on there, but you know, you can use your imagination about. There's actually quite a lot of like I don't want to say like paperwork, but there's a lot of like things that need to happen to make like an open source project be successful. And so I think like there's an interesting thing about like bringing everybody in on that, whether you're like an end user of software, or whether you're a developer, or like whether you're a CEO of a company. Like, you know, it could be like coordinating sponsorship for a project that you use. Like I'm sure the developers of that project would be very appreciative of like making that happen. So yeah, that's about time for me, I think. So thanks.
Okay, do we have any questions for yes.
Hi there. Yeah, nice talk. I'm just wondering. Sorry.
Sorry, I was like,
The likes of Oracle, do they actively contribute to how do they get involved?
Yeah, they mostly leave issues, honestly. I think there is yeah. Although like I think there's an interest, like so basically they have actually tried to make pull requests, but I've actually had to close them historically because not anything to do with the code, but because they have like weird stipulations about just corporate bureaucracy about they have to leave copyright notices in any source code that they contribute. And so like that is, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't fully understand the like legal implications of like having corporate source code like in your open source project. And so I'm just like, it's just easier for me for them just to set like, do you know what I mean? Like it's hard, it's actually more complicated to accept their code than it is just to. So I think they would like the people that I speak to, at least they would like to contribute more back, but I think there is kind of this weird legal issue with it. And maybe we could work around that and find a way to like, they basically said it could be possible, but it would be complicated and they'd have to get like a waiver and all this kind of stuff.
So what do they do at that point when you don't accept their opinion?
Yeah, I mean, they basically just say like, this is what we would like, this would be super helpful for us. Which I'm not, you know, like obviously it would be great if they also were like sponsoring the project or if they, you know, there were other ways that they were contributing. But like, I actually think like just being active and providing feedback is much better than just using it and not saying anything in a way. So like, I think it's interesting because I think there's a lot of historically like people have maybe been like, oh, it's just like, you know, like writing an issue is like people just complaining and like not really doing anything. But like there is an element of like, if people don't write the issues, then like I have no idea if something's broken if I don't know about it. So actually in a way, I'd rather people posted like a well-written, concise issue with a, you know, like with a reproduction steps. Like that to me is actually super valuable. Do you know what I mean? So I don't, you know, I'm happy that they're using it, you know, as much as, you know, it would be great if they could contribute more, but it's enough for me, at least for now.
I think it was other questions.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Okay, we've got time for one question.
Hi, have you found that you've got any benefit from OSGeo's kind of
community project status?
It's quite early days. It's only probably been like a few months, so it's hard to say exactly what the outcome of that will be. But I'd like to it'd be interesting to. It's probably similar to the kind of listing situation where there's probably a certain amount of traffic that just comes from being able to like have that flow of people going to the. I'm sure that OSGeo has quite a lot of people going to their website and looking for looking what's out there. So. Probably like too early days, but yeah, it's been. I'm super happy that I should have brought. It's unfortunately 20 minutes is not a huge amount of time, so I haven't managed to cover it. But yeah, we are like an OSGeo Community Project, and that's been like just a really cool experience getting to be part of that. Yeah, probably like too early to tell at this point, but I can only see it being like a positive thing, to be honest.
Cool. Okay. Thank you very much, James, and thank you for all the speakers.